They say Harlem never truly sleeps. But in the 1960s, it held its breath. Because one man had come home. His name was Bumpy Johnson. And when he walked through the streets of Harlem, people didn't just see a gangster. They saw a protector, a poet, a legend dropped in danger. The winter air cut sharp across 125th Street the day he returned from prison. 12 long years locked away in Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. 12 years of iron bars, cold concrete, and silence thick enough to crush a man's spirit. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson didn't break. They called him Bumpy because of the knot on the back of his head. The real weight he carried wasn't physical. It was responsibility. He stepped out wearing a dark overcoat, hat tilted slightly forward. His eyes weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They had seen too much. Harlem had changed. The music still floated out of bars and brownstones, just pouring from open windows like liquid gold. You could hear the ghosts of the Cotton Club in every trumpet note. But something was different. The streets felt watched. The Italian mob had moved in heavy while he was gone. Led by men connected to Lucky Luciano and later the powerful Vincent Gigante. Harlem wasn't running itself anymore. And Bumpy didn't like that. Here's the thing about Bumpy Johnson. He was just muscle. He read Shakespeare in prison, wrote poetry, quoted philosophy in conversations that could turn deadly in seconds. In the quiet of his cell on Alcatraz, while waves crashed against the island walls, he memorized lines about kings and betrayal. Because in his world, that's exactly what he was dealing with. Kings and betrayal. When he began rebuilding his operation, he didn't storm it with chaos. He negotiated. He understood power was just about violence, it was about balance. He made a deal with the Italian families. He would control Harlem's rackets. They would get a percentage. Peace at least on the surface. And for a while it worked. Narrow unflowed. Money stacked. The streets ran smooth. But inside Bumpy, something was different now. Prison changes a man. Sometimes it hardens him. Sometimes it makes him think. He would sit in his car late at night, engine off, watching the neighborhood lights flicker, children running on sidewalks, mothers carrying groceries, preachers locking church doors. He knew the poison he controlled was hurting his own people, and that knowledge didn't sit quietly. He was the hero. He was the villain either. He was something far more complicated. He paid for college tuitions, helped families with rent, made sure Harlem businesses stayed in black hands during a time when systemic racism squeezed every opportunity. He believed in his own way that he was protecting his territory from outside exploitation. But protection built on narcotics comes with a cost, and that cost was rising. By the late 1960s, a new generation was rising. The civil rights movement was shaking America. The speeches of Malcolm X echoed through Harlem streets. Power was being redefined. Young men weren't impressed by old-school mob diplomacy anymore. They wanted revolution. Bumpy, older now, wiser, but still dangerous, had to decide what kind of legacy he would leave behind. Was he a king holding the throne for his people? Or a man feeding an addiction that would one day swallow the community whole? One night in 1968, he sat in Wells' restaurant, his usual booth. The kind of place where everybody knew his name but never spoke it too loud. He was sipping coffee, talking quietly, then suddenly, he clutched his chest. No dramatic shootout. No police sirens. No cinematic last stand. Just a heart attack. Right there at the table. The man who survived Alcatraz. The man who negotiated with the Mafia. The man who ruled Harlem. Gone in an instant. But here's the part people don't talk about. When thousands came to his funeral, the streets filled not just with criminals, but with ordinary residents. People crying. People whispering stories of how he helped them when no one else would. Because in communities abandoned by power, sometimes the only power left is complicated. And Bumpy Johnson was complicated. But that's not the full story. There's something deeper about his connection with the Italian families. something most people don't understand about his relationship with the rising drug empire, and something even darker about the quiet deals made behind closed doors in Harlem as back rooms. A night Harlem buried Bumpy Johnson, the air felt heavy. Not just with grief, with uncertainty. Because when a king dies, even a complicated one, the throne doesn't stay empty for long. Before prison, Bumpy had worked under the powerful and feared Stephanie Street, Claire the Numbers Queen of Harlem. She was just a criminal mastermind. She was pride, resistance, and strategy wrapped in elegance. She taught Bumpy something most gangsters never learned. Control the money, control the narrative, control the fear. When the Italian Mafia tried to crush Harlem's black-run numbers racket in the 1930s, Bumpy stood as her enforcer, her shield. That war was just about gambling. It was about territory, respect, race, power. And Bumpy proved something dangerous to the underworld. He could fight the Mafia and survive. That's how he eventually built his working relationship with Lucky Luciano. But understand this clearly. It wasn't friendship. It was mutual benefit. Luciano understood Harlem needed a local face. Someone the community trusted or at least tolerated. Bumpy understood the Mafia controlled supply lines, judges, and police connections. So they struck a silent agreement. Harlem would remain under Bumpy's control. The Italians would get their cut, and bloodshed would be minimized, at least publicly. But power never stays clean. By the 1950s and 60s, heroin became the silent tsunami flooding New York. The docks, the jazz clubs, the back alleys. Even teenagers who once dreamed of becoming musicians now drifted through streets chasing a high that never lasted. Bumpy knew what it was doing. He was blind. He had daughters, a wife, a mind sharp enough to read philosophy and crime statistics in the same breath. Yet, he stayed in the game. Why? Because walking away was simple. Leaving meant weakness. Weakness meant predators. And predators don't negotiate, they devour. There were whispers that Bumpy kept a strange balance. He refused to allow certain areas near schools to be touched. He punished dealers who disrespected families. He occasionally funded community events. Some even say he maintained quiet respect with civil rights figures, not publicly, but strategically. There were rumors of private meetings, conversations about protection, about keeping outside criminal organizations from fully swallowing Harlem during its most vulnerable years. Nothing proven, but the whispers never stopped. And then, there was Vincent the Cinqueganti, the rising Italian power who would later become one of the most cunning mafia bosses in America. And like Luciano, Gigante was told school diplomacy. He was cold calculation. Gigante saw Bumpy as useful but temporary. When Bumpy died in 1968, it didn't take long for control to shift. Harlem's underworld grew less balanced, more violent, more chaotic. Quiet understanding between worlds collapsed, and the heroin epidemic worsened. Some of the younger hustlers didn't care about poetry, didn't care about Shakespeare, didn't care about community codes. They cared about fast money, and the streets paid the price. Here's something most people misunderstand. Bumpy Johnson never saw himself as evil. In his own mind, he was a man navigating a rigged system. Born in the early 1900s in South Carolina, growing up in Jim Crow America, watching opportunity shrink because of the color of his skin. The time he reached New York, crime was glamour. It was survival. He once reportedly said that if society won't give you a seat at the table, you build your own table. The problem? Sometimes that table is built on unstable ground. His wife, Mame, later described him not as a monster but as disciplined, intelligent, controlled. A man who could be gentle at home and ruthless outside. That duality haunted him. In prison, he didn't just lift weights. He studied law, history, literature. He believed knowledge was armor. In Alcatraz, surrounded by America's most dangerous criminals, he was the loudest. He was the calmest. And calm men in violent worlds are often the most dangerous. The truth about Bumpy Johnson isn't black and white. He was both protector and destroyer, provider and poisoner, strategist and street king. And maybe that's why his legend refuses to die, because Harlem remembers him not just as a crime boss, but as a symbol of a time when power, race, and survival collided in ways America still struggles to confront. But there's still one layer left. The untold details about his final years, the tensions inside his own crew, and the quiet realization he may have had that the empire he built couldn't outlive him. The last years of Bumpy Johnson's life were loud. They were heavy. By 1967, Harlem didn't feel the same anymore. The old jazz clubs were fading. The heroin trade was no longer controlled by a handful of disciplined operators. It was exploding. Younger crews were reckless. Violence wasn't strategic anymore. It was emotional, and Bumpy felt it. He was older now. Diabetes. Heart strain. Years of stress stitched into his body. The streets still respected him, but respect had shifted from fear to legend. Legends are dangerous things, because once you become a symbol, people stop seeing the man. They stop seeing the sleepless nights, the quiet doubts, the questions that creep in at 3 a.m. When even a king has no one to command. Some close to him said he had begun talking differently. Less about expansion, more about stability. Whilst planning some dramatic retirement. Men like Bumpy didn't get clean exits, but he was trying to hold things steady, like someone trying to keep a crumbling wall from collapsing with bare hands. The problem? The world outside Harlem was changing faster than he could adjust. Federal agencies were tightening down on organized crime. The Mafia families were restructuring. And within the black community, a new kind of leadership was rising: political, militant, ideological. The streets were no longer the only form of power, and Bumpy knew it. There's a quiet story never fully proven, but often repeated, that in his final year, he began distancing himself from some of the more reckless dealers, cutting ties, warning them, not out of morality alone, but because he could see what was coming. Addiction was hollowing out the neighborhood. Young men who once stood straight now walked with slow, haunted eyes. Mothers who once nodded respectfully now looked at him with something complicated. Not hatred, not gratitude, something in between. And that look weighed on him. At home, he was softer. Ming once described how he loved conversation, loved books, loved quiet evenings more than nightclubs. He didn't shout. He didn't boast. He carried his authority silently. And that's what made his death feel surreal. January 1968, Paul's restaurant, his regular booth. He had just finished a meal, was speaking calmly. No tension in the air, no threats looming, no dramatic warning, just a sudden pain in his chest. He reached for the table, collapsed, and the room froze. The man who had survived shootouts, prison riots, mafia negotiations, and Alcatraz was taken by his own heart. There's something poetic about that. A man who carried so much pressure for decades finally crushed by the weight inside his own body. His funeral filled the streets of Harlem. Not just criminals, shop owners, old neighbors, people who remembered the rent he quietly paid when they were about to be evicted, the tuition he covered, the protection he offered when others exploited them, and yes, also families who had suffered from the drugs that ran under his watch. That's the truth of it. He left behind gratitude and damage, both equally real. After his death, the balance he maintained shattered. The disciplined structure gave way to chaos. Violence increased. The heroin crisis deepened. The quiet diplomacy between black operators and the Italian mafia shifted toward colder control. Some say if Bumpy had lived longer, Harlem might have avoided some of that collapse. Others argue he was part of the foundation that allowed it to happen. History doesn't give clean answers. Here's the emotional truth. Bumpy Johnson was born into a system designed to limit him. He refused to be small. He carved out power in a world that denied him legitimacy. But the method he chose came with a cost that his community would pay long after he was gone. He was the superhero. He was the demon. He was a man navigating survival in America during a brutal era. He's smart enough to read Shakespeare, strong enough to command the streets, human enough to feel the contradictions of it all. And maybe that's why his story still lingers, because it forces a hard question. When a system gives you no lawful path to power, what choices would you make? And at what price?